Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our lab leak briefing today. I'm Justin Goodman, and I'm the Vice President of Advocacy and Public Policy at the taxpayer watchdog group White Coat Waste Project. Our mission is to cut funding for wasteful and cruel taxpayer-funded experiments, which cost the taxpayers about $20 billion a year, and I'll talk in a second about why we're concerned with this issue. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Alexis Baden-Meyer from the Organic Consumers Association, as well as our two special guests, two of the foremost scientific and national security experts on the lab leak issue, Dr. Stephen Quay and David Asher. Just to make sure we have definitional clarity about what we're here to talk about, we are here to discuss the lab leak hypothesis for the cause of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what that means is we are concerned that based on the available evidence that Dr. Quay and David Asher will lay out today, that there was a catastrophic accident at the Wuhan Institute of Virology that let loose this pathogen that has caused worldwide public health and economic devastation. Dr. Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner, put it really nicely in a tweet recently that kind of encapsulates all the issues here at play. He said, by assembling a large repository of dangerous coronaviruses into a single lab in a densely populated city and experimenting on animals, Chinese researchers greatly increased the risk of a lab leak. That's the end of the quote. This wouldn't be the first lab leak, and unless we do something about it, it won't be the last one. Now, there's growing concern for an independent investigation following the WHO's failed investigation into COVID origins. Dr. Anthony Fauci just this weekend said that he's no longer confident that the virus has a natural origin and thinks there needs to be an independent investigation into the cause of the pandemic. Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, agrees. The CIA, the Director of National Intelligence, the current CDC director all agree, as do CDC directors under Obama and President Trump. So there's pretty universal agreement at this point in time that there needs to be a bipartisan independent investigation and that we cannot trust what the WHO has done so far. So why do we care? And I can speak from the perspective of White Coat Waste and its 3 million members. Basically, in our quest to expose and end wasteful and in some cases dangerous taxpayer-funded animal experimentation, we discovered in 2019 that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was one of 27 laboratories in China authorized to get NIH funding. And we started digging into those projects, and in April of 2020, we were the first organization to expose the link between the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the National Institutes of Health, which is that the NIH has been sending money through a grant to a US nonprofit to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for experiments that we now know undeniably involved manipulating coronaviruses to make them more transmissible to humans. They were doing this by doing experiments that involved capturing wild bats who were infected with the coronavirus, sampling some, killing some. They were collecting them in a mine in southern China, bringing them back to Wuhan, and then conducting horrendous laboratory experiments involving humanized mice and other animals that I know we'll get to in a moment. So we, since early 2020, when we met with the Trump administration to express our concerns about this, have been working to connect the dots between what was happening in Wuhan and what the US government's potential involvement was or is. We've also exposed and found that the nonprofit that was sending NIH money to the Wuhan Institute of Virology was violating federal law by not disclosing how much money they were sending there. That was a repeated violation. And we've also discovered that as of today, as of this morning, on May 24th, and we've discussed this before, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, despite all of the problems that we've encountered, is still eligible to receive more taxpayer funding. And that's one of our priorities, is getting to the bottom of that and making sure it doesn't happen again. Now, I mentioned bipartisan support. I named a bunch of high-profile intelligent and scientific experts in the government who are on board with investigating this, getting to the bottom of exactly what caused the pandemic. We've also been conducting polling since the beginning of the year. We commission independent polling. This is not polling we conduct. It's conducted by a polling firm called Lincoln Park Strategies, and they've done several national polls for us asking various questions about the lab leak and COVID's origins. And I just want to read 3 different results that I think will show you how broad the support is for these efforts. 77% of Americans want an investigation into how the lab leak started. That's 84% of Republicans, 74% of independents, and 76% of Democrats want an investigation, a real independent investigation into the causes of the COVID pandemic. 60% of taxpayers, 54% of Republicans, 68% of Democrats, and 59% of independents want to defund the Wuhan Institute of Virology while this investigation is taking place. And you're going to hear a term today. I don't have to define it right now, but you'll hear the term gain of function research, which is research on certain pandemic causing pathogens to make them more transmissible to humans and deadlier in some cases. 59% of Republicans, 49% of independents, and 60% of Democrats want to reinstate the 2014 ban that the Obama-Biden White House put in place on gain of function. So as you can see, again, wide bipartisan support for getting to the bottom of the pandemic's origins and taking concrete actions to prevent them from happening again. Now, it's my pleasure right now to introduce my friend, my colleague, Alexis Baden-Meyer from Organic Consumers Association.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. If it weren't for Justin Goodman and his colleagues at the White Coat Waste Project, if they hadn't been bird talking the US funding of animal experiments abroad, it would have taken a whole lot longer to learn about the lab leak hypothesis. And as you'll hear from our speakers, though, who I can say with confidence and without hyperbole are the top 2 experts in the United States on the scientific and factual evidence in support of the lab leak hypothesis. There actually were many people with a wide range of expertise whose attention was piqued by the news that at the end of 2019, a potential pandemic virus had emerged in the city of Wuhan. The leadership of my organization were among them, having long been concerned about the lab manipulation of potential pandemic pathogens. I've worked at Organic Consumers Association since 2005, and this issue had not come across my desk before 2020. But at that time, Ronnie Cummins, our director, was writing a book with Dr. Joseph Mercola on the possible lab origins of COVID-19. This book is now a bestseller, The Truth About COVID-19. And they asked me, because I'm a lawyer, to look into how US law treats gain-of-function research on potential pandemic pathogens. I have to admit that I was initially very skeptical of the lab leak hypothesis, and I saw this as work that would distract us from our core issues. But I became very concerned when I learned that gain-of-function research on potential pandemic pathogens is very generously funded in the range of $1 billion a year or more, and it's very poorly regulated. So I'm going to post in the chat links to fact sheets on US funding of gain-of-function research on potential pandemic pathogens, including funding that directly supported the Wuhan Institute of Virology's work on bat coronaviruses, and US funding that the Wuhan Institute of Virology still gets today for unrelated research. So this has been a very hot topic, obviously, since Senators Rand Paul and Roger Marshall questioned Dr. Anthony Fauci, and it will likely remain a hot topic as support for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19 continues to grow in Congress. There are several bipartisan bills, bicameral bills on the topic, and I would like to call your attention to one in particular, the Strategic Competition Act. This bill has a section on investigating the origins of COVID-19, and it seems to be moving the fastest. So there are also powerful players outside of Congress who are now weighing in on the importance of an investigation into COVID's origins. There is now a COVID Commission planning group at the University of Virginia. It is chaired by former 9/11 Commission Director Philip Zelikow. It's funded by Eric Schmidt of Google, Jeffrey Skoll of eBay, Charles Koch, and the Rockefeller Foundation. So I don't think there's much of a question any longer whether Congress will investigate the lab origins of COVID-19. But there is a question of what kind of impact this investigation will have. We have never been through anything like COVID-19. To quote CJ Hopkins, we're living through one of those historic transformations of the structure of political power that we don't usually recognize until after it has occurred. So this is a unique moment in history, but there is at least one precursor, the 2001 anthrax attacks. And even after that event was definitively linked to US biodefense laboratories and at least one US scientist at Fort Detrick, spending on the very same biodefense research was actually increased. So we might learn everything that there is to know about the origins of COVID-19 and still not be able to change course. Despite the lab leak hypothesis having been raised at the very beginning of the pandemic, it wasn't really taken seriously until now, a year and a half later, when most Americans are trying to put the pandemic behind them and are unlikely to pay much attention. So if justice delayed is justice denied, and investigation delayed is an investigation denied. 2020 was an election year. I think it is fair to say that the perceptions of Americans regarding the origin of the pandemic may have shaped the 2020 elections in at least a small way. So for someone like me, personally, who has no quarrel with the outcome of the 2020 elections, maybe that's not such a big deal. But I know that means more to others. So no matter why you believe, it is important to look into the origins of COVID-19. I'm really glad that you've joined us here today to learn more about it. We have the top two experts on the subject for you. Our first speaker is Dr. Stephen Quay. He is an MD as well as a PhD. Dr. Quay has more than 360 published contributions to medicine. He's been cited over 10,000 times, placing him in the top 1% of scientists worldwide. He has invented 7 FDA-approved pharmaceuticals. He holds 87 patents. He's founded 6 startups, including Atasa Therapeutics, a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company developing novel therapeutics and delivery methods for breast cancer and other breast conditions. Over 80 million people have benefited from the medicines he has invented. So Dr. Stephen Quay's scientific manuscript on the topic of the origins of COVID-19 is a Bayesian analysis concludes beyond a reasonable doubt that SARS-CoV-2 is not a natural zoonosis, but is instead laboratory derived. This manuscript has been viewed over 135,000 times. His video is a nice short video. It's called 5 Undisputed Facts Support the Laboratory Origins of the COVID Virus. That's a great summary for you to keep and share after you've watched this longer presentation. So Dr. Quay is also the author of a best-selling book on surviving the pandemic, Stay Safe, A Physician's Guide to Survive Coronavirus. He has received his MD and PhD from the University of Michigan. He was a postdoctoral fellow in the chemistry department at MIT with Nobel laureate H. Gobind Khorana, a resident at Harvard MGH Hospital, and Dr. Quay spent most of a decade on the faculty of Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Stephen Quay.
Well, thank you, Alexis. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I'm in the process of sharing my slides, and now I hope you can see them. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to brief the folks from Congress on this. My prepared remarks will take about 20 minutes, and I understand there'll be a Q&A at the end after David speaks and some other conversation. So these are the 5 undisputed facts favoring a lab origin of COVID. Let me see if I can, there we go. As Alexa indicated, there is a publication that's much longer of my Bayesian analysis of this. been viewed over 137,000 times, downloaded over 100,000 times. And it was given to this list on the right here in draft before it was published. This list includes Dr. Fauci, Collins. The people in yellow are members of the WHO commission that visited China recently, and many other prominent virologists. And no substantive criticism has been received on this analysis. Before we get started, let's define a few terms that may be new to some of you. One of them is the word zoonosis. So what is it? I've tried to highlight in red to help you with the word. It's an animal infection with a microbe that then jumps to humans. And so this process, it can be sort of any animal with a spine or a vertebrae. So for example, malaria, which comes from mosquitoes that don't have spines, is not a zoonosis specifically. It's very interesting. SARS-CoV-1, I think most of you remember that or know of it. You've heard of it recently in the news, because it began as a community-acquired zoonosis, but it ended as a lab-acquired infection, and that part of it is probably not so well known. The beginning story was that first cases were in workers from wet markets or restaurants in southern China. But in July of 2004, when the WHO announced that the epidemic, had ended, all of the later cases, all of the next cases were laboratory staff working with SARS who went to hospitals near their work. So in fact, I went ahead and calculated the last 4 patients who were laboratory workers. They went to hospitals about 15 kilometers from their lab. And of course, when you do the same analysis for Wuhan, you see the first patients were appearing even closer to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So from the very beginning, I think for people who understood SARS-CoV-1's origin or its ending, both a community-acquired zoonosis and a laboratory-acquired zoonosis were both viable hypotheses. With respect to community-acquired, the bat, as everyone agrees, is a reservoir host, that is a virus that can sit there for decades and not really cause an infection in bat cells.
Buddy Stephen Quay.
Mm-hmm.
Can you still hear me? And the second is the intermediate host. With respect to the laboratory-acquired zoonosis, the Wuhan Institute of Virology is the leading candidate. The Wuhan CDC is a second, and there's an institution with many workers who got sick very early called the Wuhan Institute of Biological Products. It's a vaccine company that's very close to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The initial problem, the location problem for the natural origin is articulated in this slide. The first patient is 1,500 kilometers from the closest ancestral host in nature, but is only 3.5 kilometers from the closest ancestral host in a refrigerator at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. For translating this to the American audience here, this is like a patient in Manhattan getting sick from a bat virus in the Everglades. So it has a location or a distance problem. One of the interesting things that I want to focus on is, in fact, how the community-acquired zoonosis and laboratory-acquired zoonosis or infections are similar. In the case of the community, of course, it's an animal that's either in the wild or in a market that's infected, and then it jumps to humans. But the laboratory-acquired infection is exactly the same thing. It's either an animal in a laboratory or perhaps cells from an animal in a laboratory that are purposely infected with microbes. A staff gets sick, asymptomatically leaves the door, goes into the community, and begins to spread it. Today, what I'm going to focus on, however, are the differences between a community-acquired zoonosis and a laboratory-acquired zoonosis. If I had just one word for the two, it would be diversity versus singularity. So with respect to a community-acquired zoonosis, it is multiple jumps from animals into humans from a diverse population. So there are many animals involved, there are many genetically varied viruses, and many pre-epidemic infections occur, and they can be measured with samples stored in the laboratory. On the other hand, the laboratory-acquired zoonosis is a single jump. It's one animal or one test tube with cells from an animal that are infected. It's one genetically pure virus, like a vaccine. People in laboratories don't like to work with messy genetic viruses. They're always pure. And finally, there's no pre-epidemic infections. It's just one lab worker walking out the front door, sick one day, and spreading it into the community. So this focus between diversity and singularity will be the crux of my talk today. First, let me talk about the concept of seroconversion. This is a hallmark of a community-acquired zoonotic infection, is evidence of repeated abortive, that is, they didn't work, jumps into humans until finally enough human adaptive mutations are acquired to permit efficient human-to-human spread. But a record of these abortive jumps is maintained in archived hospital specimens. So hospitals save everything. You give blood at the hospital, they save it. You can then go back and look at these saved specimens for either PCR for the virus or antibody tests for the infection. The beauty of this method is it permits classification of an epidemic as a community-acquired zoonotic event without having to find the animal host for the virus. So as shown here on this slide, on the left, you see with SARS-CoV-1, the civet cat was infected with this, and over 90% of the animals, excuse me, in the markets were infected. And it would jump to a human and it would burn itself out because it didn't have all of the tools it needed to do human-to-human transmission. Finally, on November 16th, 2002, it got that last mutation it needed to not only spread inside of civet cats to jump to humans, but then to support human-to-human transmission. That was the day it got the last mutation it needed. The lab origin, of course, starts with a pure culture of a virus that exits a lab in a single human, and there's an absence of abortive community infections pre-release, so there's no seropositivity. So fact one that no one disputes, everyone agrees on, is there is no evidence of pre-epidemic infections. COVID-19 wasn't smoldering in the community before the pandemic began, as was observed with previous coronavirus epidemics. So quoting, a total of 9,522 stored samples from patients with influenza-like disease in Wuhan and the surrounding area in late 2019 were tested for SARS-CoV-2. All were negative for SARS-CoV-2, according to the WHO report. Now, based on similar testing for two previous coronavirus epidemics, SARS-1 or MERS, we should have seen 1 to 4% of these as positive. That's 100 to 400 positive tests, not zero. The probability that a community-acquired zoonosis would produce these results, that is, no seroconversion, is less than 1 in a million. In fact, Dr. Shi from the Wuhan Institute of Virology and Dr. Dasak from EcoHealth used Wuhan residents as a negative control. As a control, we collected 240 serum samples from random blood donors in Wuhan, 1,000 kilometers away from Jining, which is in Wuhan, southern China, and where inhabitants have a much lower likelihood of contact with bats due to their urban setting. As expected, none of these Wuhan patients showed seroconversion. So the first item was pre-epidemic infections. There were none with this, unlike the expected many in a community-acquired zoonosis. Fact two, there are, of course, no animal host exists at this point in time. Neither the COVID virus nor any close relative has yet been found in nature, unlike prior natural zoonoses. So before I go through this data, I do want to speak to the incredible investment of time and resources China put into looking for this virus in the world. It's unprecedented. There's been no surveillance of nature as great as the one done in 2020 by Chinese. But in fact, after more than 80,000 wildlife, livestock, and poultry samples collected in 31 provinces in China, no positive results were identified for SARS-CoV-2 antibodies, that is infections, or nucleic acid, that is viruses, before or after the outbreak, according to the WHO report. Now, virologists in May 2020, some of the most prominent virologists in the world, looked at the structure, looked at SARS-CoV-2, and they said, quote, the animal host would probably have to have a high population density based on the properties they saw. But of course, that wasn't the case. The prevalence with this data has to be less than 0.004%. Now, as a reminder, the Wuhan Institute of Virology has shown with MERS in the Middle East or with SARS, the prevalence was over 90% in the market. So we're comparing infinitesimal to 90%. Again, using statistics, the probability that SARS is a wildlife origin with this result is less than 1 in a million. As a reminder, in 2003, 17 years ago, when our technology was much more primitive, it took only 4 months to identify the civet cat as the intermediate host. In 2015, it took 9 months to identify the camel as the intermediate host for MERS. And here we are 16 months with SARS-CoV-2, and there is no host identified in the world. So despite the fact that we predicted many animals for a community-acquired zoonosis, there are none. Though I believe the one animal that infected the one human was in a laboratory, and you can look forever throughout China and never find it in a host. Fact 3, SARS-CoV-2 started genetically pure, just like a synthetic vaccine. The COVID coronavirus had little genetic diversity at the outset, unlike prior natural zoonoses. The hallmark of nature is diversity. Go into the woods versus going into a farm and think about the genetic diversity. That's how nature handles changes in environment, like climate change and other threats, by having that genetic diversity. In fact, most of the major players in virology, Dr. Shi at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the WHO itself, noticed the genetic purity at the outset. Dr. Baric wrote, quote, "Early strains identified in Wuhan, China showed limited genetic diversity, suggests the virus may have been introduced from a single source." Here's an interesting quote, Dr. Shi at the Wuhan Institute. On January 23rd, she wrote in a draft of her paper on the internet, "The almost identical sequences of this virus in different patients imply a probably recent introduction in humans." I think she then realized the error in her ways and what that implied, because by February 3rd, when the final version of this paper was published, this sentence had been deleted. The WHO in April of 2020 wrote, quote, "All the published genetic sequences of SARS-CoV-2 isolated from human cases are very similar. This suggests that the start of the outbreak resulted from a single point introduction in the human population around the time that the virus was first reported in humans in Wuhan in December 19. And finally, the Scottish and Australian virologists, very prominent, Rambaut and Holmes, wrote, "Because of the early sampling and genome sequences, the root sequence of SARS-CoV-2 is known. Many of the genomes from the earliest sample cases are genetically identical and hence also probably identical to the most recent common ancestor of all sampled viruses. This occurrence is different to previous viruses and epidemics," end quote. So before we get into this, I want to show you how we trace the jumps from one human to another. On the left here, you see 10 mutations, you see 10 patients, and you see their mutations lined up in frequency. So you notice every one of these patients has mutation number 1, including patient A. But when you look at mutation number 2, it's missing in patient A. Interesting. You look at mutation number 3, it's missing in both A and B, and so on. When you give a computer this information and ask it to produce what's called a phylogenetic tree, the results are what you see on the right here. The patients are chronologically ordered in where the infection jumps. So you can assume from virology that the B virus came from the A patient, and it jumps chronologically down this chart because these mutations are additive. So in fact, all 1.6 million sequences that are in the German database GSED can all be placed in a chronologic order by this process back to the genetic root virus in the genetic index patient. So would you like to know who the genetic index patient is? This is called the clade A patient, or the root genetic index patient. Here's the identification of this in the database. It's a 39-year-old man who was actually sampled rather late on February 5th. He had no exposure to the market, but I think for me the most interesting fact is he was being treated at the General Hospital of the Central Theater Command of the People's Liberation Army of China in Wuhan, about 3 kilometers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This data was made available by Dr. Hu at the PLA hospital, and remarkably, it was available to the public on the internet on January 30th, 2020. And so I am quite sure that no one on this call, on this video, knows anything about this patient. I'm not saying that there's anything nefarious, but I certainly would like to know why the first patient genetically with SARS-CoV-2 was at the PLA hospital. Again, it's a reminder, this is not the earliest patient. The earliest patient is probably in the fall, in maybe October, November. This is the earliest genetic patient we have, but it is the root virus from which all other viruses came. So what this means from a learning point of view is that, so you have over here on the left, the virus in bats, you have 1,100 mutations to get to that first patient in the PLA hospital, clade A. And then these two mutations, which are seen in all clade Bs, identify that clade. And then you go from there for the full 166 million cases. What this means is that if you are shown evidence of the origin of SARS-CoV-2 and it's not clade A, that evidence is wrong. So fact number 4 is that the markets in Wuhan were not the source of SARS-CoV-2. Why can I say that? Because only clade B, or in one unusual case, a downstream clade A, were found in any of the markets, according to the WHO. So for example, if hypothesis 1 is that COVID began in the Hunan market, then environmental samples should be clade A. WHO tested them, and in fact, they are all clade B as shown here. That hypothesis is unsupported. Hypothesis 2, if it began in the market, the animals should be positive. And in fact, with 336 tests, there are no positives. And finally, if hypothesis 3 is correct, the patients from the market should be clade A. In fact, this chart shows the 4 clade A shown here in the boxes. They are all clade B, and these 11 brown squares are the market patients. All 11 early COVID patients that were associated with the market had clade B. None of the 4 early clade A patients had any association with the market. It did not come out of the market, it went into the market. Now, this is really frustrating because the WHO has censored early non-market related cases. This paper in Lancet from February 2020 shows the early cases as reported by these Chinese physicians. You'll notice that the first case in this paper is December 1st, and that out of the first 4 cases, 3 of them are not related to the market. How did the WHO translate this data in their report? Well, they censored all of those initial patients, so that in their report, the first 3 patients shown here are said to come from the market. This is not science, this is obfuscation. And so this should not be happening. So in fact, when you look at all 3 of the primary features of a zoonosis and examine whether there were many animals or one, many genetic variants or a pure culture, many pre-epidemic infections or none, they all line up with a lab-acquired zoonosis. All the evidence points to a singularity. Now let's go into the facts around whether this was a natural virus that was escaped or a manipulated virus. Fact 4 shows that COVID's powerful infectious trigger isn't found anywhere in its related viral groups in nature, but has been repeatedly inserted into viruses by laboratories, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The spike protein you've probably heard of, it's the thing that sticks out, gives it the corona of the coronavirus, gives it a crown in Latin. It has an insertion, this red arrow here, this red section here, 4 amino acids, 12 nucleotides, and this is not found in any other coronavirus in a related group. It's absolutely unique, and this has been looked at out to 1,000 different viruses. In fact, it's what I call the immaculate insertion, because it's both unique at the protein level, which I just showed you on the chart. So it's the only protein furin insertion in all related coronaviruses. The probability of this is less than 1 in 100,000. And it's the only genetic signature that uses a word dimer, CGG, in all related coronaviruses. This is a particular codon or word in the genetic sequence that's nowhere in the other related viruses. The probability of this is 1 in greater than 500,000. But in fact, a laboratory inserted furin cleavage site is always a gain of function. And laboratories have been inserting these since 1992. These are the laboratories around the world, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology and other laboratories. So again, if you want to cause a gain of function in a coronavirus, you put a furin site into it, it's plain and simple. This slide, which is rather busy, but on the right here, I want to show you the furin cleavage site permits immediate cell surface fusion. So this is SARS-CoV-1. It has to go through a complicated process, and only at the end of the process does its genetic material get injected into a cell. SARS-CoV-2, because of the furin site, can inject its genetic material immediately. This not only expands the species it can reach to, but also the cellular tropism, which cells inside an individual animal can be infected. So while it can infect the lungs like SARS-CoV-1, it can also affect the brain, the heart, the endothelium, the blood vessels. This is why this blood clotting issue keeps coming back. And this is part of the furin cleavage site. So my question, if I could ask Dr. Sheev, one question is, why did she not feature the furin site in her seminal paper? First week of February, she publishes a paper that's the first detailed description of this in Nature. It is the most viewed paper in Nature in the last 10 years. 1 million people have viewed it. In this paper, if the site came from Nature, the furin cleavage site from Nature, an innocent virologist would have been highly motivated to describe this as the first example of a furin cleavage site in this class of coronaviruses. She does not do this in her seminal paper. I apologize for the detail here. You can find it in the paper, but there's 3 blue boxes. So she highlights this insertion and this insertion and this insertion, but she stops at position 675. I've highlighted here. Why did she stop here? Because 6 genetic letters later is the furin cleavage site called polybasic cleavage site. She did not reveal the furin cleavage site. This is a woman who has been studied 16,000 coronaviruses and never found a furin cleavage site in this class. A woman whose laboratory has put furin cleavage sites into viruses and published them. And she has a furin cleavage site and she doesn't tell the world about it. This could have saved many lives if she had informed us of this. It took a French-Canadian group to later be the first to describe the furin cleavage site in SARS-CoV-2. So this later paper was the first to describe this site. And remarkably, in their paper, they write, quote, "This furin-like cleavage site may provide a gain of function to the 2019 coronavirus for efficient spreading in the human population." You know, this is why she didn't describe it in her paper. Now, I wanted to find a way to illustrate to you folks what kind of experiments could have been going on in the Wuhan Virology laboratory and allowed this release. Remarkably, Dr. Baric and Dr. Shi have actually published the study that I would have described to you. This paper, entitled Pathogenesis of SARS in Transgenic Mice Expressing Human Angiotensin Converting Enzyme, was received for publication on March 12th. I've gone through this and I've examined the calendar, how you do all of these experiments and get this done by March 12th. And if they did perfect laboratory work, I've been in the laboratory quite a bit over my 30 years, 40 years in science. But if you went into the laboratory and did every experiment perfectly, no repeats, you'd have to start no later than January 28th. But this experiment, if done in 2019, would be exactly what I would tell you would be the precursor for releasing SARS-CoV-2 through an infected staff member. So fact number 5 is that the virus is highly adapted for infection of humans from the start, unlike prior natural zoonoses, but growth in humanized mice would allow this lab adaptation. I call this the pre-adaption trifecta. Whether you look at the whole genome of the virus, just the spike protein, or the equipment that the virus uses in the human for transmission, they all show a pre-adaptation. This is the whole genome level. So looking at SARS-CoV-1, you see 2 phases. You see a lot of mutations early when the virus is learning how to grow in humans, and then consolidation where it starts making fewer mutations because it's figured out how to do this human-to-human transfer. SARS-CoV-2, of course, hits the ground completely pre-adapted. It was ready for human-to-human transmission in that first patient. This study looks just at the spike protein. This is a remarkable experiment. This group in San Francisco changed 3,800 amino acids in the spike protein to see which ones would improve the virus. If there's a blue spot, it was an improvement. If there was a white, it was a neutral. And if it was brown, it made the virus worse. So as you see here, there's a lot of white and brown. And in fact, 99.5% of the amino acids selected for SARS-CoV-2 were perfect. And an example of an exception is one of these blue squares, this N501Y. This is the UK strain that caused such a stir in the fall when it was spreading through the United Kingdom. So it took this virus millions and millions of natural infections in humans to find this spot. It was otherwise 99.5% adapted when it started. Finally, the WIV had 3 cases of SARS-like infections in the fall of 2019. As you know, the Wall Street Journal reported that this weekend. Despite this fact, both China, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the WHO have reported that no cases in a staff of 590 at the WIV, no cases of SARS-CoV-2 were reported. I and a DRASIC member, Gils Dimanov, just last week published a preprint where we provided a statistical analysis of the likelihood that there were no cases. And our analysis says it was 1 in greater than a trillion chance. And here's the link if you'd like to read that paper. It's a lot of math crammed into 21 pages, but it indicates that there's no chance that the WIV did not have infections. So in summary, SARS-CoV-2 is a singularity. There's 1 animal, 1 genetically pure virus, and no pre-epidemic infections that is consistent with a laboratory-acquired infection. It also has 2 key gain-of-function features: a unique furin cleavage site never seen before in nature, but commonly inserted in the laboratory, and a pre-adaption by serial passage in humanized mice is a likely outcome with no evidence of free epidemic circulation. Without a public debate on whether gain-of-function experiments should continue without a change in current regulations, the next pandemic is right now being created somewhere in the dozens of laboratories around the world doing this dangerous work. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Quay. That work represents hundreds, if not thousands of hours of research, reading, and looking into this. It's really an incredible body of work that you've presented. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. David Asher. In 2020, Dr. Asher spearheaded a State Department task force investigating the origins of COVID-19. Secretary Mike Pompeo published the unclassified findings of this task force in January 2021. It's in Fact Sheet Activity at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So over the last 25 years, Dr. Asher has advised the US government on countering money laundering, terrorism financing, and sanctions evasion schemes, as well as campaigns to undermine nation state and terrorist adversaries. He has developed and conducted whole of government investigations into international issues involving nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons development and proliferation. Dr. Asher has a doctorate in international relations from Oxford University. Welcome, Dr. Asher. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. Am I going out live? I just want to say it's a great opportunity to be working with 2 excellent organizations that are in the nonprofit arena of true activism and entrepreneurship and policy. Thank you so much, Justin and Alexis, for your great support, and the impact that you're having is being felt. I want to say up front, after 32 years of being an Asian studies person who's lived in China, lived in Japan for many years, in South Korea, the treatment of Asian Americans in the context and Asians around the world in the context of COVID-19 has been outrageous. And whatever I'm about to say, I want to be very clear. I wouldn't have spent much of my life in Asia loving a lot of Asian people if I didn't care tremendously about them. But I also want to note that the Communist Party of China, which tortures its people, holds them in gulags, and runs a prison state via social media and other means, is not like any other government on the face of the earth, except maybe their cousins in North Korea. And we have to recognize that this is not about Chinese people. This is about the Chinese Communist government. And it's important to understand that this begs a totally 100% bipartisan policy approach. I'm going to sort of stay in the policy lane, which is my lane, and also highlight a few investigative facts before going on a little bit of a polemic of what I think needs to happen in terms of action, because we got to focus on what do we do now. We now are, I think, beginning to realize, as Dr. Quay just elucidated, the complicity and involvement of the Wuhan Institute and other labs in China affiliated with the government in what appears to be a biological weapons program using gain of function techniques, which only can really be distinguished from weapons or biological defense means by intent. And the intent revealed by the Chinese government due to its systematic cover-up of the facts, allowing a virus to spread around the world without alerting people, is to me clear. I've been involved in criminal investigations. As a criminal investigator, I would say the Chinese should be indictable at the People's Republic of China government, not the Chinese people level. And I think the Chinese people would fully welcome the PRC government, their communist state and dictatorship, being held accountable by all of us. And I mean all of us around the world, not just American citizens. We identified three key facts in our investigation at the State Department. I came in as a professional investigator. I was not a political appointee. I've worked in both Republican and Democrat administrations. I was very proud to work under President Obama, leading the economic war plan to take out the Islamic State and reduce the number of civilian casualties by targeting the financiers. So we didn't have to go out into an all-out war. We hit the money and we destroyed it. Happy to send people a little video of $2 billion burning up as we bombed a bank that broke the Islamic State and killed very few people in the process. That's my goal in life, is non-kinetic ways of countering bad people and bad organizations and governments. But we saw three things at the State Department in our nonpartisan investigation, which related to arms control. Was number one, the Wuhan Institute was working on undeclared, under the Biological Weapons Convention, classified work with the People's Liberation Army on a program that we saw having no defensive orientation. Okay, I can't give you the facts as to why we felt it was more offense than defense. You just have to trust me, and maybe those will come out if the Biden administration could please do what the Trump administration should have done and reveal the basis for that analysis. We also saw that the Wuhan Institute researchers who were involved in the work related to coronavirus, immediate predecessors to COVID-19, were the first people to fall sick that we became aware of. That's in the cover of the Wall Street Journal today. And we also saw that there was a attempt to clean up the laboratory and take action remedially, both in October and November. And this is something that has drawn less attention. There is information on the internet. I can't confirm it, but I can tell you it's consistent with Dr. Redfield's analysis and my own, that this probably started in October, that there was some sort of systematic cleanup and shutdown of the Wuhan Institute. What happened there, I have no idea. But was there an event that resulted in a cleanup? I believe there was. I don't know what they were trying to clean up, but it must have been something really bad, because you don't shut down a whole national laboratory like that. Let me also not let anyone forget that in 2014, the French government, our allies, our friends, and some of the great biologists in the world were very conscious about, the need to protect the environment and animals and other things, and including humanity. We're engaged in a robust partnership with the Wuhan Institute of Virology related to the construction of the BSL 4-level laboratory. That's the laboratory where you do the most dangerous research, including with animals. And I'm not a big fan of researching on animals, but at some stage it might be necessary. But I am, at the same time, what I find incredible is that Dr. Fauci, Dr. Collins, and the whole world ignored the fact that in 2018, the French government was kicked out of the Wuhan lab that it had just built, the level 4 laboratory, which is basically the secret lab. And 50 researchers from the Moreau Scientific Company, as well as the Pasteur Institute, were banned from working together with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In the face of that, and I talked to colleagues at the State Department about this, no one in their right mind should have allowed research to continue with of any sort, including especially our own government or the Europeans or the Asian governments, with this laboratory in Wuhan. If they're going to kick out the people that built this thing, who had a huge civil partnership that wasn't military related at all, they obviously were trying to hide something malevolent. And indeed there were. And so what I want to stress is 16 months after the initial word of an unfolding pandemic or a disaster, certainly related to COVID-19, began leaking out of Wuhan, China, the Chinese government's reaction remains totally surrealistic. You know, we've had hundreds of offers of assistance. I counted at least 26 offers in January alone from the State Department of unclassified assistance to the Chinese to say, can we help you? Can we help you clean it up in a way that we did, including with SARS and MERS and avian flu and other issues involving public health, potential epidemics, and where the Chinese in the past had said, yes, please come and help us. They were been pretty reluctant, but they still said, we welcome your assistance. This time they totally shut us down. I've never seen anything like this in my entire career in government, and I've been involved for 3 decades. Today we know way too little about the who, what, where, when, how, and why surrounding COVID-19 origins. And I compare it to a Dali painting where the clocks have melted, but time has not stood still. We got to start the clock here, and we got to start the clock on holding the Chinese accountable for what happened in Wuhan and what will happen to the world if we don't get ahead of this. Don't think this is the beginning of the end of a problem. This is the beginning of an era where synthetic biology and the world of warfare are going to converge. Whether this was a military accident or not, there was definitely a military program going on. It definitely involved the people that first fell sick. It could be a coincidence. I really doubt it. But we should be scared a great deal. We're scared about, synthetic biology affecting all sorts of aspects of our public health. The idea of a military adopting synthetic biology as a fulcrum or center point of its entire national military strategy against the world, and then leaking it out through some accident or some disaster and then covering it up, should scare the heck out of us. Because what are they going to do next? And it's not just what China would do. I will attest to you here that before I left the State Department, I became aware that every terrorist organization on the face of the earth was becoming interested in exactly this type of synthetic biology gain of function work being used to attack all of us. So don't think that this is like just an incident that happened we can put in the rearview mirror. I feel like we need to feel that way as an American citizen whose family's been affected. I've had several friends die of COVID. I mean, everyone has been affected in so many ways. We've had $20 trillion plus in damage to our economy. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's worse than the Great Depression. My PhD is actually in economic history, so I can attest to that officially. But China's dead pool of lies about COVID's dangers, its denials that it could spread human to human, alone have cost the world trillions of dollars, millions of lives, and shaken the globalization of the world system to its core. And globalization is a very important thing for us. It's what stopped us from having World War III back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and up to today. Okay, so what the Chinese are doing through their obfuscation, their denials, their suppression, their human rights abuses, is in effect threatening the entire world system. It's not just affecting the poor people of China, and there are many poor people of China who I know well who are being affected. And they're poor not because they're not wealthy in some cases. They're poor because they're deprived of their human rights, their ability to speak, their democracy, their ability to engage in commerce, and frankly, to protect their own environment and state and society from the ravages of a communist system that's truly out of control. And let's not forget, who's benefited from this thing? Well, China has. They just screamed back to life in the last, the first quarter after the COVID epidemic had been suppressed, quarter two of last year, their economy started to grow. And the last 12 months has grown by 18.2% of GDP year on year, and their exports have grown by 49%. Okay, now, is that a coincidence? Is it because the Chinese are so aware? I don't know. Let me bring back a little fact that Dr. Quay could comment on. On February 26th of last year, the Chinese government announced an initial vaccine program involving, I believe it was Sinopharm, I might be wrong about the company, one of the two Chinese companies. They told us at the State Department that their diplomats had already been vaccinated, so they didn't need to wear PPE in meetings. Okay, that came about in the summertime of last year. What on earth is happening here? How could they have developed a vaccine by February, or late February at least, of last year, if they hadn't been working on it since the beginning of work that they were doing related to coronavirus, probably funded by the military, which we think kicked off in 2016, which, by the way, was the same time that the Chinese government stopped unclassified, officially declaring COVID or SARS as a research priority for biodefense at the Biological Weapons Convention. Coincidence? Maybe not. How's that? You know, the key thing is, I think it's now time, and I'll take it out, whether the white gloves or the black gloves, we need to take the gloves off against Beijing for its malicious handling of COVID and start amping up coercive pressure against its systematically planned and executed intransigence, indifference, and cover-up. And whether one believes COVID came from a zoonotic host, a bat cave, frozen food shipments from Southeast Asia, or more likely an accident emerging from the Wuhan lab research for a stealth bio-coronavirus-based weapon of mass destruction, the world needs answers from the Chinese Communist government. And the answers they're not going to provide unless they face substantial costs, a need for, and a penalty for continued obfuscation, disregard, and inaction. I'm not going to get into all the details here, but I do believe there's a number of factors at play that we need to cite. One of them is our own government's mistakes. What the heck we are doing working with this communist government on providing them access to biological technology and expertise that could be used for a biological weapons program in the name of science. And, you know, I don't think that Tony Fauci and Dr. Fauci or Dr. Collins deliberately aided and abetted an enemy state, okay? They didn't do that. But their own program, which was extremely controversial among their own people, was something they were well aware of could lead to harm against humanity, including the American people, and you know, and frankly, to just the viability of our free state and society, and a high level of health standards and healthiness among our population. They knew that this thing could get out and cause a disaster. That was warned by the National Academy of Sciences in 2018 in a report that's about 180 pages long and signed by dozens of famous scientists. They basically talked about biological gain of function and its relationship to biological warfare. And they predicted there'd be a disaster or accidental disaster like what we've encountered. So the scientists in there were right, unlike the scientists who've been involved, almost all of whom tied to Wuhan and to the Chinese government, and trying to cover this thing up. You know, and the way that the journal Lancet and the journal Nature and Nature Medicine have been used as propaganda arms of the Chinese government, and as part of a systematic program of deception and denial and dissuasion to whitewash, or I call it the Wuhan whitewash, which the Wall Street Journal copied, I think is outrageous and untenable and unacceptable. So we need to take on a number of punitive measures in the event that the Chinese don't provide full assistance, the likes of which Dr. Quay and the Paris group of scientists he's a member of described a couple of months ago. And what that means is, unless they open up their labs, their lab books, their people, show us all the data, change their entire approach to this, we need to allow for American citizens, we can start with our own citizens who've been affected by this and who've lost lives, to sue the Chinese government. We did this against the Iranian government. We've done this against the Russian government related to corruption and Magnitsky Act violations. We need to sanction the Chinese government and allow for civil torts. That would send a message that would be very, very difficult for the Chinese government to avoid, because after all, the Chinese say that all these private sector firms all come under the communist state. So could we sue Bank of China in Los Angeles and seek damages from it on behalf of the 600,000 or so Americans, or 650,000 have died so far of COVID, and probably many more to come? Why not? Should we sanction the Chinese government for violating the Executive Order 13382 on WMD proliferation, which is extraordinarily encompassing and powerful against weapons proliferation? Yeah. Were they working on a biological weapon here? Yes. Was it deliberately leaked? I don't care, actually. I don't want to be heartless and cruel, but we're dealing with a communist adversary that is not respecting the rights of any of us, especially its own people. So someone's got to bring them to tether here. And finally, I am a believer that we need to develop a network of biosensing around the world to try to monitor for this type of thing. Andy Weber, my colleague at the Council of Strategic Risk, calls it the Worldwide Weather Service of biological threats. It could be natural, it could be human, it could be anything. At least we should try to get a grip on it using next generation sequencing technology and other techniques, and sharing of information. All of which the Chinese have shown they're unwilling to do. If they're the only country in the world that's unwilling to join in some international open skies agreement related to biology, well, they'll sort of identify themselves as the problem, not the solution. We should welcome their participation, but if they don't participate, then there should be significant implications. So on that note, I will say thank you very much, and let you go on to a conversation with your and discussion among your participants in the audience.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Asher. That's a very powerful presentation, especially knowing that you can't actually tell us every little thing that you know that has helped you come to these conclusions. So we respect your opinion on this very much. Thank you. So we have almost a half hour left of this program. We can open the floor to questions. We could, you can ask questions anonymously in the Q&A. So we could leave the recording on and do it that way. Or if I see hands raised and people want to actually, have a sort of a face-to-face conversation, we could cut the recording. So let me know by how you want to engage here and ask questions. If you want to put anonymous questions into the chat and we can keep this recording going, or if you'd like to raise your hand and give us, get a chance to speak to our presenters today. Dr. Quay, do you want to respond to Dr. Asher's presentation at all while we're waiting for people to ask questions?
Well, sure. No, I appreciate all the things that David said, and I'm familiar with much of the things that he has brought up. I think that he made a subtle comment about perhaps virus work, a vaccine work that was being done at the Wuhan Institute that hasn't been discussed. And I think that that's something that you'll be hearing more about in the coming weeks and months. So again, the concept of if there are vaccines that can be identified in public samples that are supposed to be from patients in a hospital in Wuhan, for example, if you find an unusual vaccine sequence that's never been seen before, begins to put together the pieces of what might have been going on in 2019. So again, a true bioweapons program was going to have the development of the weapon, of course, and then the development of the antidote for your own people. So you're going to need a vaccine to protect your own folks from something like that. And if you see both components at the same time in the same laboratory, it begins to tell the story, even if the people aren't talking.
Yeah, that seems to be a distinct possibility. Let's see, I see a question here. How deep is the Western media in on this CCP cover-up, specifically downplaying and outright denial of the lab leak theory?
Would you like me to comment on that?
Thanks, yeah.
Well, look, first, I respect our media. We need a free media. We shouldn't have this Trump administration, the way that they treat the media was, to me, outrageous. I found it distasteful, but also somewhat ridiculous. I mean, our media are one of the things that keeps our country straight and strong and distinguishes us from other, much more totalitarian oriented states, especially the Chinese, let's face it, in the People's Republic of China. But the thing is, I worked operationally against the Chinese, not just as a policy person. They are more than capable of covert information operations at a level of sophistication that is somewhat astonishing. They are capable of cyber operations, infiltration. I wonder if Dr. Quay's signal is being interrupted a bit on this conversation. I've seen a few blurbs and outages, probably because he's one of the people, along with me, that's been cited as a potential enemy of state of the Chinese. But we're not enemy state of the Chinese people. We're enemy state of the Chinese communists. It's and what the Chinese communists are capable of doing with the media and the way that they've infiltrated our state and society and academia is extraordinary. Josh Rogan, a friend of mine, has written a great book about the U.S.-China relationship and what the Chinese did, not only related to COVID, but also, and how the Trump administration responded, in some cases successfully, in some cases terribly. It's quite unbiased, Washington Post reporter, but he also really gets into the information and denial and deception operations of the Chinese and how they have, let's face it, they paid off an enormous number of universities and researchers around the country and the world. Part of it is letting doctors like Dr. Quay come into this Chinese Candyland playground for synthetic bio gain of function research. I mean, you can do almost anything over there. I mean, including, by the way, as we've learned, experiment on human beings. I mean, the Chinese bragged about their experiments on civilians and military, members of their military, using gain of function techniques involving CRISPR. I have no idea if they're really doing that or not, but it's just crazy. I mean, they were trying to inject synthetic things into people's biology to make them stronger. I mean, it sounds like right out of Adolf Hitler to me. But the Chinese have been extremely good at influencing the media, and they've sent out an enormous number of warnings to people. They more or less guided this Eco Health Alliance up in New York, in its research. The Eco Health Alliance had Peter Daszak, amazingly on December 31st, began tweeting out what was going on in Wuhan. That was before anyone in the U.S. government that I knew, other than the CDC, who I guess he was talking to, which is, we welcome that. But it's almost like he was being controlled by a Chinese adversary. I can't say that with definitiveness. I respect Dr. Daszak, I guess, but I don't understand why later on, like around the middle of January, he started sending emails to people at the NIH and at the NSC and National Homeland Security Council, including Tom Bossert, the head of it, saying there's absolutely no evidence this came out of a lab. It came out of nature. We didn't think it came out of a lab then. I mean, that was a little bit later, when Trump started tweeting about it. I don't know if Trump even knew that there was evidence about a lab thing. Frankly, until my investigation under the Arms Control Bureau kicked off with the support of the secretary in October, we didn't really know what had happened in Wuhan. I mean, I found that back in April, it was a lot of speculation. There might have been some sensitive intelligence, but certainly it wasn't assessed by anyone in the U.S. government intelligence community that this was a supernatural event. So the question is, why did the media jump to that conclusion? Some of it was distrust of Trump. Some of it was just distrust of, the possibility that any government would be so crazy as to use synthetic biology as a weapon. Let's face it. But, we got to suspend disbelief and look at what the Chinese have been saying. For the last decade, Chinese leaders and Chinese military leaders have said publicly dozens, if not hundreds of times, that they're interested in biology as the future of warfare. And we didn't pay any attention to it in the U.S. government. And shame on us. So, sorry.
And what's your perspective, Dr. Quay, on that? I know that you've sent out press releases about your research and you tried to make it very accessible. And yet it wasn't until Nicholas Wade, a former New York Times science writer, published his report just in this last month that some of the research that you've been doing has been, part of the conversation. So do you feel that there was, do you think that there were Western media influences that downplayed and denied the lab leak theory?
Well, I mean, I think I'll try to stay in my lane in the science side, but there was a major paper in Lancet with over 20 authors major paper in Nature in May, so February, May, these two bookends. We know the Lancet paper was orchestrated by Peter Daszak. I mean, it looked like it was independent, but through Freedom of Information, an organization was able to get the emails showing that it was actually a well-orchestrated display of solidarity for the Chinese scientists, which is a good thing, but then a strong denial that it could possibly be a lab origin when there was no data. The second paper in May, again, speculates very strongly on various aspects of the virus, that it did not come from the laboratory, but in fact, there's no science in that paper to support those feelings. So as David has said, I think we're working with a very strategic approach to this by the Chinese, putting a groundwork of scientists in place, saying that this is a conspiracy theory. I think the media cannot be faulted for maybe going along with it. They didn't necessarily look for the story behind the story, because all the scientists were saying the same thing. So we all probably got duped in some ways, but we're here now, and I think it's time to move forward with a further investigation.
Yeah, and I'll note that, when we made the connection publicly between the NIH and the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the grants that had been funneled there through EcoHealth, and just to clarify for folks watching who didn't make the connection, the US nonprofit that was sending NIH money to the Wuhan Institute of Virology was called the EcoHealth Alliance, and Peter Daszak, who Dr. Quay and Dr. Asher just referenced, runs that organization. That group has gotten over $60 million in taxpayer money. They've been working closely with the Chinese Communist government for decades, and they had a lot to lose by this being linked to the lab that they were coordinating with and sending US money to, and basically had made a career of collaborating with, gotten awards from the CCP. So there were a lot of reasons to be skeptical of anything Peter Daszak was saying. And if you look at his social media for the last year, he virtually never shares any single US media pieces. The only media he is bragging about is typically interviews he's doing on Chinese state media, discounting the lab leak theory and promoting the natural origin theory. Constantly sharing CCP state media, constantly parroting those talking points. And unfortunately, he was the expert who, because of his connection to coronavirus and to the laboratory itself, rather than questioning what his motives might be, the media was relying on him uncritically as a spokesman about what might have happened. And when we made that connection in April, 60 Minutes did a story where they lionized this guy as if he's trying to save the world and we're just being unfair to him. And Washington Post did a story saying that it was nonsense, speculation. They they mocked us by name. And there's never been a retraction or a correction on that story. There's just so much media out there that was buying into basically what were China's talking points from the very beginning without realizing it. And now we're seeing people like Anthony Fauci, who also has a lot to lose by this going to lab, if this is a lab acquired infection, as Dr. Quay has compellingly illustrated. There's going to be a lot to answer for, whether it's Francis Collins or Anthony Fauci, who from the beginning have also been essentially parroting the same talking points from the CCP, which is there's no evidence this is a lab leak, that's a conspiracy theory. They've been saying the same thing. So when you have the top scientists or seemingly top scientists on an issue and the media is comfortable relying on them, and you have Donald Trump on the other side, who was the loudest voice talking about this, the media climate was such that we ended up where we were, where it's taken literally over a year for the world to come around to the idea that the science, the most plausible explanation of this at the moment is the science pointing to a lab leak, a lab accident, some kind of lab acquired infection, and not the crazy wet market theory, which Dr. Quay, explained after testing over 80,000 animal samples, there's not a single animal who has the virus, but you have a lab that has a virus that's at least 96% similar, maybe even more, and manipulating them openly to try to make them more virulent to human beings. Now, what makes more sense there? 80,000 samples with no match, or a lab that we know they have one of the largest libraries of coronaviruses in the entire world and was actively trying to make them able to infect humans. And here we are, 3 million deaths later. So people can believe what they want.
They are the lab with the most specimens. And I think the other incestuous point that people should really realize is There was one American scientist on the WHO commission that just visited China and wrote a report, and that's Peter Daszak. So he was literally investigating the lab that he finances. And that conflict of interest was actually pointed out by many prominent virologists and was just ignored by the WHO.
They hid their
I just
money.
want to say,
Yeah, go ahead, David.
just one thing. When I was leading this investigation at the State Department, which unfortunately has been abrogated, I remain astonished and disappointed, and you know, I want this administration to succeed sincerely. I just can't believe that one of the first things they did is stop the arms control related investigation that I had led, as if it was some political vendetta, which it wasn't. I mean, we declassified the most sensitive facts that we had so that the American people and the world would get to know what we had been encountering. I made a huge effort to do it. Again, I don't understand how this thing's gotten partisan, except I'll blame President Trump for that. I mean, okay. But I also blame my Democratic friends now for not understanding that, you know, this is something that's affected the world. It's only going to get much worse in the future if we don't actually impose a cost on this type of behavior or misbehavior. It's outrageous. And I mean, this behavior is not just the United States, the Chinese, it's the United States government itself. What we were doing, spending $10 billion on gain of function research that seemed to predict almost nothing, prevent almost nothing, and develop no effective therapeutics. They claim mRNA was developed as a result of it, but I think that there's good reasons to say that it was being developed for other reasons. You know, maybe the DoD funded a little bit of it, but that's not enough to say that you can justify $10 billion. And, you know, how many, you know, monkeys and animals were experimented on using ridiculous gain of function, cruel techniques, frankly. I mean, I'm not a animal rights activist the way some of you are, but I do feel a sympathy, you know, toward, you know, the cats and dogs and rabbits and monkeys that are being, you know, put under, they're being given levels of virulent toxins that would never exist in nature. And, you know, it's causing them excruciating, like, demise, you know, I mean, they all get euthanized. I mean, I don't understand it. I'm for, you know, things that can help humanity and the animal life do better and live longer and be stronger. But I'm not for just waste, fraud, and abuse as a private American citizen related to some scientific kleptocracy that happens to be firmly embedded with the Communist Party of our main adversary in the world, the Chinese Communist government. I mean, it's like, can we just stop the madness here, please? So I really want to emphasize the need for Democratic colleagues and friends, and they are friends, to try to understand that, you know, maybe this is just an opportunity for them to say, well, Trump did this and he should have stopped it. Well, he should have stopped it, frankly. And why he didn't stop it, I don't know. But, you know, I mean, I think that Dr. Fauci, as Justin has shown, in the first 2 weeks of the administration, chaired some meeting to undo the gain of function ban that Obama had imposed. But ironically, that never had been fully functioning against virus research with the Chinese, which is really the most dangerous thing. Andy Weber and Christine Parthomore from the Council of Strategic Risks, who are, you know, both former senior Democratic appointees under the Obama administration, are tremendous civil servants, leading an organization that has done research into coronavirus and other viruses. And as weapons experts, they basically said these are excellent weapons. As the whole world should know, this is a tremendous weapon. It's extremely low cost. They've managed to kill, you know, the most expensive people to treat in our state and society, the people who many of us care the most about, our parents and grandparents. They've driven us crazy psychologically. And again, I don't think they deployed this intentionally. I think that they were developing something. It got out because they had shoddy lab safety practices, which the U.S. Embassy had reported on for years, and which the Chinese had even admitted. I mean, their own director of the BSL-4 lab, Yuan Jiming, has a journal on biosafety, and he cited his own laboratory as a problem with biosafety. So, I mean, like, they don't even hide it. So why the heck, especially in the wake of the French being evicted, and us becoming aware that the Wuhan Institute was engaged in some classified research, did we allow any sort of U.S. government cooperation to go forward? I wholly encourage your supporters, Justin and Alexis, to focus in on this, to call your members of Congress and ask, what on earth is happening and how can we stop it in a way that will help the world and recover from this disaster that we've jointly encountered. So
Yeah.
sorry for my soapbox, but I just want to say thank you.
About
Thank you.
about vaccines, and it's not a question that we can answer on this panel because it's related to how we're using vaccines right now, but it did prompt me to ask you something that I've been wondering. When I first researched this, it seemed obvious that gain-of-function research was primarily related to military research. And I was slow to learn that gain-of-function research can also be related to vaccine research. And I've seen some scientific analyses of this virus where one theory is that perhaps they were trying to create a live attenuated vaccine, perhaps a pan-coronavirus vaccine, something that would be able to be used against all types of SARS-like viruses and maybe even MERS-like viruses. Is it possible that this was, as some people have described, an industrial accident? And in the course of vaccine research, which we do not regulate under the Biological Weapons Convention, and that we even exempt from gain-of-function research as it's currently described by HHS.
Steve?
I have two comments that I'd like to make, and then if that's possible to that. And one is, I think, related back to something David said. I just want to put a fine detail around the concept that this may not be the worst thing that could happen, and there may be a second chapter that's even worse. In examining the raw reads, as they're called, from the first 5 patients that the Wuhan Institute of Virology studied. So they published the raw reads, so you can fish around in there to see what else they were working on. Literally, it's quite amazing. There is concrete evidence that, in fact, they were doing similar kinds of gain of function and other kinds of experiments with a virus called the Nipah virus. Now, what is Nipah famous for? It's always fighting. It's the Hertz and Avis with Ebola. So one is 90% fatal, the other is 90% fatal, one's 85. So in other words, gain of function research is being done on a virus that's not 1 or 2% lethal, but 85 to 90%. Your second point on whether this could in fact have been a pan coronavirus vaccine is very interesting and maybe prescient. Last week, for the first time, someone published an amazing paper which showed, hey, this SARS-CoV-2, which we've talked about going in through the ACE2 receptor, being a unique way like SARS-1, it actually has really high affinity for the MERS receptor, which is a completely different receptor. This research is literally 7 days old, and so we're still dissecting it. But the concept that this virus can actually use both receptors, again, something completely unprecedented in nature. Viruses don't waste time doing that kind of thing in nature. They're really kind of lazy. If they have a good way of getting into a cell, they stick with it. If you want to make a vaccine, however, that both will stop MERS and SARS, that's exactly what you would do. So this very recent research, again, I didn't talk about it because it's not an undisputed fact yet, but actually can point directly to this having possibly been vaccine work.
Go ahead, David, but you need to unmute.
Am I unmuted? Okay, so let me just say about vaccines and biological warfare, because I've worked in this area for many years. A vaccine, as Dr. Quay mentioned earlier, can also be an anecdote. I've talked to some of the most important national laboratory scientists in the world and international collaborators in the area of biological warfare and biological defense. And it is totally characteristic, if one were to engage in an offensive biological warfare program, to develop a vaccine that would encompass its most extreme points. And COVID-19, we could assess, would be one of those points, but maybe not the only one. And that I believe that there is there is evidence that there was vaccine research going on into COVID-19. As I mentioned, there was a vaccine deployed on February 26th. I can't see, I don't know, I'm not an expert on vaccines, but I have a lot of friends in medicine who are, and no one in their right mind has said that you can come up with a plausible explanation of how they had a vaccine that they could use on people that early, unless it had been development for months, if not a year before or more. And then there's a question, of course, did they have a lab accident and did they inject a insufficiently attenuated vaccine into their workers who've been exposed to some monkey bite or something like that? Very plausible from what researchers who I know, who know researchers at the WIB who've said, not classified, just people I've talked to. A lot of them feel there was an accident and that perhaps they rushed out a vaccine that was sort of the antidote and it actually spread the coronavirus. That's just a little rumor I heard from some birdies, but I do think it's possible. So an industrial accident could have happened with the vaccine, but a vaccine could also have been part of a response to an accident in a lab. So thank you.
Well, it's starting to make sense to me, but this is such weird stuff, and I hope we never have to deal with it again. But I think it's better to be prepared and create good policy so that if we ever do, we're better on top of it than we were in 2020. Justin, any last words for our attendees?
No, I would encourage everyone, if you work in an office that is interested in engaging on this, as Alexis mentioned earlier, there's a number of pieces of legislation looking to combat different parts of the problem that we've discussed today. There is growing support among Democrats for engagement on this issue. Chairwoman Anna Eshoo from the House Energy and Commerce Committee, chairwoman of the Health Subcommittee, has said that there is a need for an independent investigation into COVID's origins. Congressman Brendan Boyle from Pennsylvania has also expressed concern about the bad job the WHO did. And there is bipartisan legislation right now, the Strategic Competition Act, which has been rolled into the Endless Frontiers Act now, that would allow some investigation into COVID origins. So there are a lot of opportunities to engage on this issue. My email address is justin@whitecoatwaste.org. I posted in the chat, the very first item in the chat is our organization's one-pager on the issue, which has our contact information on it and links to a lot of the things I mentioned in case you want to verify anything I said. But yeah, we'd be happy to help direct folks who are interested to other offices that are engaged on this issue.
Absolutely. There is one last question, if we could take a minute or two of our panelists' time. The question is, curious to know anything about a document written by Chinese scientists and Chinese public health officials in 2015 discussing the weaponization of SARS coronavirus. It describes the virus as a new era of genetic weapons that can be, quote, artificially manipulated into an emerging human disease virus, then weaponized and unleashed in a way never seen before. Can our panelists confirm that that document exists?
I've seen both the Chinese and an English language version. That's the extent of my confirmation.
Yeah, I mean, I've read the document. There are many other documents beside that that are important, and I can try to circulate a list of them. It's difficult to follow all these threads simultaneously, but the open source unclassified statements of the Chinese government and the military have been highly disturbing going back many years. Let me just say it finally, because it's important. The United States State Department, my department, in 2016 presented evidence at the Biological Weapons Convention meeting in Geneva that the Chinese biological warfare program involves synthetic biology as an important element, and that they laid out the threat. I remain totally puzzled as to how that was sort of forgotten. You switch, I think we went from one administration to the other, and that's what happened. We need the Congress to do oversight. We need members and staff to not forget these things. Because the Chinese were put on warning, and some of one of the reasons for that was these statements and these papers and these articles, of which there's quite a few, related to this. And the Chinese typically sort of don't hide their fingerprints on something. They try to lay down a bit of an alibi or a marker, just in terms of the way the Communist Party works. in hybrid warfare. They come out and make some broad statement, and then they sort of eke into the darkness under the cover of that. So, they're always going to be able to say, I think, that, oh my God, we were just doing this because the WHO and the US government and NIH supported us, or we were doing this because it was a vaccine for biodefense, even though you're creating a vaccine against a virus that doesn't exist and probably wouldn't exist. I don't know. At one stage, I asked some biostatisticians, what was the probability of a bat-borne bat backbone of coronavirus to combine with a receptor binder of a pangolin or some related species of pangolins, what I've heard, combined with a furin site of that's humanized. And someone said it was like 1 in 13 billion. I can't vouch for that. Dr. Quay, maybe the last word should be yours. What do you think?
Yeah, that number's that's a reasonable number. I mean, I've tried to do it another way and say how many years of natural evolution could lead to a good afternoon in a synthetic biology laboratory, and you can generate a couple millennium, a couple two to 3,000 years of natural evolution in a good afternoon in a synthetic biology laboratory. So, yeah, I mean, we're in a new age.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. All right, are there any other questions? I'm looking at the chat. Doesn't look like it. All right, well, thank you everyone for attending. Please do feel free to follow up with questions. We're happy to connect you with Drs. Asher and Quay if you have follow-up questions as well. And yeah, please take a look at the materials we posted in the chat and let us know if you need anything else. But we appreciate your time. We know how busy you are and are grateful that you spent the last 90 minutes with us.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.